Thank you, Grace. Thank you. Thank you to Nina. Thank you to Katya, to all the CSW people for all the organizational work. I know there's a lot of work that goes into hosting people, to getting rooms organized, set up, people moving from place to place. So I'm really grateful and also honored to be invited to be here. Okay, I'm just checking the starting time so I stay on time because I do have slides. I'm going to admit from the beginning I have too many slides, so we're going to like zip through some of them, but I didn't want to leave. We might return to some of them during the Q&A. That's why they're all here. And what I'm going to do is try to keep my talking part to 30 minutes, so we have 30 minutes for Q&A, because my experience is that really we get into the meat of things with people's questions. People usually have a lot of questions about how to write a first book, how to publish their first book, how to meet editors, all those kinds of things. So if it seems like I'm moving too quickly, don't worry, we can come back. We'll have time. All right. First one. All right, so first section, I just want to talk a little bit about big picture conceptualization of book projects. And so this really is probably where I'm going to spend the most time. And then some of the nuts and bolts stuff we can come to in the Q&A. All right, so when I think about book project and I'm looking at a proposal, I am looking for some kind of big things, right? And the first one is what I call argument and intervention. And then I'm going to distill these down into like what and why. Some people don't like the intervention part of this, so why sometimes is a better way of framing it. But this really is like when I read somebody's cover letter, I look at their proposal. There's two things I want to know, and one is obviously, what is this book about? And then why does it matter? Or what are you trying to accomplish with the book? What kind of motivates the book? And that's the intervention question, or the why. And I think sometimes people get caught up in the what, or they start to conflate the what and the why. And so just being able to step back to your project and say like, okay, this is what I'm doing, and you know, what's the payoff of that, you know? And when you start asking yourself that question, sometimes people will come back and be like, oh, because no one's done it before. And I'm like, well, okay, is that inherently interesting? Maybe, maybe not. So digging deeper into that question. And then just want to say like that intervention, I think sometimes people get caught up on the intervention thing because it feels too maybe theoretical. And interventions can be conceptual, theoretical, they can be, but they don't have to be. I mean, they can be all kinds of, they can be disciplinary if you are trying to shift the way your discipline is thinking or writing about something, if you are trying to tell a different history of something that's already been told, methodological, if you are trying to, you know, offer a new methodology for your discipline, for an interdiscipline. So that intervention question can take a lot of different forms. And then just that we're going to kind of continue on this question about how you expect readers to engage with your book, but kind of why will it matter to them, I think also helps people when they're trying to formulate that intervention description. It's like, okay, how do you expect somebody to take up your books, you know, your ideas? Often when people are sort of puzzling through this, I'll like ask them like, okay, if somebody else was citing your book and their work, and they were saying, as da-da-da argues, da-da-da says, and they were going to encapsulate that, you know what I mean? They were taking your idea or your work and they were going to encapsulate it to use in theirs. How would they do that, you know? What would they be saying? So sometimes just framing it from the reader's perspective, oh, okay, that's why the reader's going to, you know, be interested in my book. That's what I'm expecting them to take away in the big picture. Sometimes just flipping the script in that way can help you to articulate what you're doing. Stay on time here. Okay, so then the how follows from that. Form and structure. In some ways, this seems like obvious, that you will have a form or a structure to your book. And I was trained, as Grace said, in literary studies. There was this kind of like given of a form when I did my dissertation, that I was gonna have this introduction, and then I was gonna have these 4 case studies that were sort of revolved around particular texts or particular authors, and that was the form that was just a given at that time in literary studies. And I didn't, to be honest, I didn't question that. And it wasn't really until I got into publishing that I started to question that and question the value of it. And it can be valuable. This is not to say that structure isn't valuable, but it's a convention that's sort of accepted, right? And so I think stepping back and thinking about what conventions maybe in your own writing you are accepting or not accepting can be useful, right? Because it's okay to say that's the convention in my field, and that's what's going to make my work legible to other people. And so I'm sticking with that, that convention. And there's a reason why we have some of these, forms and structures in our writing. Because when people, I work with a lot of people, and this is down at the bottom, who more recently, I've seen more of a push against a lot of scholarly conventions and forms in writing. More attention to the writerliness, more interest in breaking with these conventions in order to think differently about questions that have been thought about in maybe the same way over and over again, and maybe the form has something to do with that. So just being aware of okay, I am using a particular convention because that helps me. It can be a shorthand. Scholars know how to read the conventions. If you were in anthropology and you're setting up your ethnography in a certain way, well, that's going to be easily available to the readers in your field, right? If you're pushing against those conventions, then it's not going to be easily available, and then you have to work all the harder. So this is the advice I give to people when they come. They say, well, I'm writing a poetic or this or some other kind of thing that's, not the normal academic book. And I'm like, that's great. You're going to have to work twice as hard to make this book work. And if you want to do that, that's great. And if you can make it work, that's great, because you're going to have to teach your readers how to read this book, right? You're going to have to instruct them on where the ideas are, how to engage with them. All right, I feel like I lost a whole bunch of points in here because I guess I can look here. I keep looking up here. Let's see, did I miss anything? We talked about the conventional forms, chapters building upon each other, right. So this is the thing that's often missing when I mentioned, being schooled in literary studies and that form of the 4 kind of case studies. As I learned, and continue to educate other people in, what's often missing from that form is the connection between the cases, right? So that if you construct a book or a dissertation or whatever in that way, that you have a central claim and then nodes, oh, okay, here's 4 iterations of this argument that vary, but they're all just different iterations. You haven't exactly set your reader up to want to follow you across those chapters, right? Because it's well, if they're all sort of 4 iterations, do I need to read all 4 iterations? Why? Maybe you do, right? But you have to motivate the reader to want to follow you from chapter to chapter. So really thinking about, why are these chapters here? Why are they in this order? And if somebody was going to follow me from this chapter to the next, what would be interesting to them? Why would they want to keep going? How am I building the argument across those chapters? I do think that with first books, that's the part people have to work on the most. I think there's 2 things. Usually with the first book, if the first book is coming from a dissertation, the first thing is getting that intervention an argument up front, because people, I think, often finish a dissertation and say, oh, that's what that book is, that's what this dissertation is about. Right. And so it's sort of taking those insights, bringing them all the way to the beginning, and then guiding the whole book from those insights. So that's sort of a major overhaul. And then the second is this, like, okay, once you've done that, then why is this a book, right? What's the bookness of it? Why would somebody have to read all of these pieces? And I understand that's presuming people will read the whole book and read across the whole book, and I don't kid myself that everybody does that. But you should hope for it, right? You should construct your book for it. And then I talked a little bit about non-conventional forum. I'm happy to talk about that also in the Q&A because it comes up a lot. And I mean, I do think some of the most exciting scholarship that's happening right now is happening with people, you know, pushing against really common scholarly writing, and that's great. But it does require work. Okay, who? So this is, you know, really thinking about who you're trying to engage with your writing. And so I try to conceptualize books as part of like a larger conversation. And maybe when you think about it, it's like, okay, that conversation can have smaller bits to it. You write a blog post, you write, you know, an article, that's a bigger statement. You write a book, that's a pretty big statement in a conversation, right? It does take a little bit of the pressure off of the book, at least in terms of trying to think like, this has to be perfect, unassailable. I'm writing this book and it's the definitive statement. Because you don't actually want your book to be the end, right? You want it to be the beginning of a conversation. The hope is it provokes something and that people do respond to it. You know, at least as a publisher, that's the hope. I do have authors who say, like, I wrote this book and now I'm just hiding from it, you know. Don't ever say that to your editor. Just as a side note, because it does not make us happy. We really want people to, you know what I mean, like, you might be tired of it, you might be exhausted from it, but the hope is that you really, that it's valuable and that it does, you know, create some kind of response. Sometimes I tell people, it's like, well, think about this as, you know, who would you want it to read your book as? Like, who do you hope will invite you to give talks? Who are you hoping, you know what I mean? Like, where do you expecting the response to be from? Who are you trying to engage with in that way? And when I put this kind of conjuring, does your audience already exist? Are you calling them into being question here? Because I was having a conversation with an author a couple weeks ago, and they said, oh, I hate this audience thing, I hate it. I don't want to think about my audience. Okay, fair enough. And then they said, well, it's because the audience for my book doesn't exist before I write it. I'm calling them into being, basically. And I was like, well, that's a beautiful, it was very poetic and beautiful. Like, I'm conjuring my audience. And I was like, okay, but you're still doing this work then, right? Like, even if you're not identifying your audience as like a pre-existing block of people, you are still, like, you know what I mean? Like, it is still the calling into being, right? Like, hey, I'm addressing you out there. Like, I'm hoping you want to come, you know, talk to me. So I like to keep that in people's minds. And particularly because, you know, a lot of the books that I edit are interdisciplinary. So this question comes up a lot around like who the readership is, and loosening some of the ideas around that of like, oh, it could be disciplinary, right? It could be very like, I'm writing Latin American history, and this book is for Latin American historians. They're my base audience. That's who's going to come to this book. That's who's going to be interested in it. Fine, you know, that's great if you know that's who you're engaging. A lot of the people I work with though are like, well, you know, I'm talking to this field, and this field, and this field. And then maybe get caught up in the idea of like, well, there's so many different people. I have to include this part for this audience, and then I have to include this part for this audience. And I'm like, no, please don't do that. Because, you know, if you try to include each group individually, you end up kind of, nobody feels like at home, you know what I mean, in your work. And so thinking about how to include all those audiences in a way that, yes, people will come with different backgrounds and different knowledges and expertise, but you're trying to actually kind of roll out the carpet for everybody, you know, everybody within that group, even if they come from different areas. And so thinking about like, well, what are the questions that that audience is interested in, right? Even if they're coming from different disciplines, different interdisciplines, whatever, from academia, not from academia, whatever it is. What are the like common questions that they are congregating around, right? And the example I like to give for that is affect studies, right? Because that was, I don't know, that wasn't really a field. At least when I started at the press, even though the press was publishing things that eventually came to be understood as foundational to that as, you know what I mean, as a field. But people who were writing in the area were writing to people interested in it, you know what I mean, in a certain set of questions that eventually got named as something else. So, you know, that's, I think, a helpful way of thinking about like, okay, if the people you're talking to are coming from different places and they don't have a name yet, that's okay, right? Maybe you'll name them, who knows? Right, so we talked a little bit about inviting readers in, that's part of that. And then I just the parenthetical about what counts as good writing depends on your audience, because people can get a little caught up on that, right? Because some people might be writing in a more, I don't want to say technical way, but like more theoretical, very academic, philosophical way. And that can be totally fine, you know, for your audience. Some people will be like, no, I need to write in a way that's, you know, more accessible for a broader audience or people coming from different fields. Also good. But just knowing and being conscious of what you're trying to do, I think can set you up well. The introduction sets the stage, right? So this, I would say with probably any book, but probably with the first book the most, the introduction is what gets rewritten the most. I don't know, people who've already written books are like, yes. It's the part that gets worked and reworked. It tends to be iterative, you know, as you are sort of as you formulate the ideas of the book and you keep coming back to them and are able to kind of reframe them and rethink them and sharpen them. And a lot of the work that needs to be done in the introduction is giving your readers a tool set for going into the book. So occasionally people will get a little bogged down with their introductions because they think that they need to say everything up front. And you do need to, there's a certain amount, like, frequently when I'm coaching people on the introduction, it's like a little push and pull of like, yes, you absolutely need to get the main argument intervention up front. It needs to be guiding the book. It shouldn't be hidden somewhere at the end. You don't need to be keeping secrets. It's not a mystery novel. That's often what I tell people. This is like, people often when they reflect on this, are like, this is what I tell my undergraduates. It's like, yes, this is like on the big scale. You know, what your undergraduates are doing in a short essay, it's like, often that advice also applies in the bigger framework of a book. There's no, you know, there shouldn't be secrets. You should be saying everything up front in terms of the, you know, the ideas, the intervention, but you can't weigh your reader down with too much either. So often I'm sort of encouraging people to think about like, okay, what are the tools, what's the knowledge your reader really needs to have already on them, backpack or tool belt or whatever, as they move forward into the chapters. So what conceptual, you know, frameworks, what historical, whatever it is, methodological, whatever it is, it could be all those things. What do they need to know to be able to go forward? And that sometimes helps people to pare it down, to be like, oh, I don't have to load you down with a lot of things that you're not going to remember before you get into the next chapter, you know? And that's really the be reader oriented. Sometimes I have a little, I didn't include it here, but like I have like a little framework where I think about it as like scholarly writing on one end and like journalistic writing on the other end, with scholarly writing being very oriented towards like, I have something to say, I know something, and like I'm, you know, putting this out there, and journalistic writing tending to be more oriented towards like there's something you need to know. It's very informative, right? And thinking about that kind of dichotomy, like how might the journalistic impulse help the scholarly writer? Oh, I'm not just putting information out there because I know it. I actually think this information will benefit you as a reader. So how do I, like, you know, kind of bequeath this to you in a way that might be useful? All right, so that's that. Am I staying on time? Yes. All right. This is where we're going to just kind of breeze through a little bit. And I am happy to come back and talk more because I had planned on talking in detail about like what goes into a book proposal, but most people want to kind of know about it. Again. All right, so 4 components, I'm going to go through it. You know, if you are submitting a book proposal to a publisher, most publishers have guidelines on their website. They say exactly what they want. Some publishers are very, very like, they want exactly these things and you need to give them exactly what they want. British publishers in particular seem to like have forms and things that they want. I don't know. We're not really like that, and I think a lot of other presses are. It's just like there's, you know, basic components, and as long as they're there and as long as the information is useful to me and I can access it, you know, I don't get too caught up in the and how it's done. But some places do. Okay, cover letter. I won't read all this stuff, but you know, a page introducing yourself. You know, if there's some background kind of information, putting that in there. The short, compelling description of the project, which may be lifted or shortened from a book proposal. And then just key information that the editor will need. Because, you know, obviously the cover letter is the first thing you're looking at. So just having a sense of like, hey, I met you at Asian American Studies. We talked briefly about this project. Here's the project. You know, I've sent the proposal to 2 other presses, but I'd love to work with you, for whatever reason. Like, that's kind of what I need to hear. So that's, you know, just kind of getting that in the cover letter. The proposal, sorry, this is a lot of text. I realized when I put together, one, I am not a good slide maker, and this is where it becomes very clear that I'm a book editor, because it's just like text, too much text. So, sorry. So, right. So, like I said, sometimes people know, like presses will say exactly what they want in the proposal, and you should just do what they tell you to do. But this is sort of what I look for. Obviously, the things I just mentioned about argument, intervention, scope of the project, who you're in conversation with. I frame it that way more than like some people will say like competing titles or like marketing information. And some people do have very are marketing savvy and can kind of provide some really helpful information about that. But mostly we have marketing departments, we're editors, we kind of know that part. So I'm much more interested in hearing the who you're in conversation with, the surprising books or thinkers that you're, that you're connecting with. Not just like competing titles, but like the orbit, the world that your work is going to be, a part of. That's more interesting to me than competing title. So audience, right, we talked about that a little bit. Sometimes this is also the place for saying more specifically if you have ideas about readership that's beyond regular scholarly audience. If you kind of imagine that there will be people outside a broader readership that will be interested. The joke used to be this isn't as relevant anymore, but they're like, Oprah's gonna want to read my book. So, unless that's really true, unless Oprah, try to think realistically about that. If you truly do have connections to a trade world, you've done other kinds of trade writing, articles, things like that, blog posts, and you have that experience, then yes, you should draw that into the proposal and make sure the editor knows. If you don't, it's just aspirational. Wouldn't it be great if everybody in the world read my book? Then maybe think more realistically. Your editor will appreciate it. The chapter details, we talked about that. That's one of the main components of a proposal is just the chapter descriptions, with some attention, of course, to how those chapters fit together, as we talked about. The status of the project, this also can go in the cover letter, but this is sort of essential information of the manuscript is complete and ready for review. I am completing the manuscript and will have it done in August. I have written 2 chapters and am just now, I'm trying to solicit, I know which editors are interested. Whatever it is, sort of laying that out to give the editor a sort of realistic sense of where is this project? What would the next step be if I were interested in this, in moving forward? Length, images, things like that. So just, just a general word count, image count. If for some reason you were thinking about color images or something specific beyond the standard black and white, produced book, you should say something about that there. Presses may or may not be okay with that. It does cost. There are challenges. And then, anything else that you think will help the editor understand the book and the goals. Sometimes people have digital projects, they have side projects, things like that, that are relevant and might bring attention to the book or might be interactive with the book in some way. Okay, sample chapters, I'm not gonna dwell on this. Sample chapters, yes, you should share sample chapters. 1 or 2. So I prefer to read real chapters, not articles, because articles just shows that you can write an article. I want to know you can write a book. And then CV, this is my little pitch for writing a good CV. I think CVs are really interesting. I love to look at people's CVs when they send me their proposals, because it just gives me a sense of where the person's been circulating. You know what I mean? Conferences do you go to? What side projects do you have going on? What other kinds of things are you doing? You know what I mean? It just it gives me some of that information that I'm often seeking about audience and things like that. Where are you already being read, right? all that kind of information. That helps me to frame the book. Okay, I'm a publisher. Again, something we can talk about more in the Q&A. So this is a question people always ask. Some version of, when do I approach a publisher? How do I figure out which publisher? Oh, there's not one answer to this question. There are some kind of basic ones about like figuring out who publishes, who's doing interesting work in your area. But even that, like, lists change over time. Publishers' focus change over time. So sometimes, like, the press that published the most interesting work in your field might not be the right place anymore. Or there could be some other place that's, like, emerging, because an editor is, like, interested in an area and is cultivating a list. So you have to really, sometimes you just have to get in there and start sorting it out. Having meetings with editors, especially if you are going to in-person conferences, that's really a great way to get a sense of who's publishing what, who's going to be interested in your work. So that could be circulating around the book exhibit, looking at the books that are coming out, maybe informally meeting people at book booths. That can look like setting up meetings ahead of time with editors. The question of like when to do that is, it really depends on the person. You should be seeking meetings with editors when you really know what the book is about, right? But beyond that, I meet with people at every stage of the process. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes I have really short meetings with people when they're still finishing their dissertation. I'm going to, the next few days, right? People are working on their dissertations. I'm meeting with them briefly. We're talking about what they're working on. Maybe I give a little advice. My first advice is usually finish the dissertation. In part because I do think like, it's like you have to, people sometimes are thinking so far ahead that, I'm like, just finish this. Then you can start on the process of turning it into the book. Like, I hate to get people, like, can get freaked out thinking ahead to the book. You know what I mean? Or like, this is your first hurdle. So sometimes that's the advice I'm giving, but you know what I mean? Sometimes I'm having these conversations and it's just like, yeah, that sounds really cool. Like once you finish the dissertation and you've got a proposal, get in touch with me again, let's talk more. Sometimes people are just past that stage where they've finished the dissertation and they have reframed it. And that can be, honestly, that can be one of the best times to talk because maybe you haven't done all the work of revision, but you have rethought it and reframed it, and then you can get initial feedback. Hey, does this look good? How does this sound? And I can say, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? We can have a conversation, but you haven't sunk so much time and resources into it that getting that feedback will be devastating. Because sometimes, sometimes people will come and I'll be like, well, I think for my list, I'd want it to look like this, but you've already spent 2 years revising. Like, I'm not going to tell you to go do something totally different just because I think, you know what I mean? That's the way you should do it. So sometimes those kind of early conversations can be useful. But, just tell people you have to kind of figure out your own constitution. Some people don't want that. You know what I mean? Like, want to have a clearer sense of their project before they initiate those conversations because it could be either difficult or they just want to feel confident, So this is all just to say there's not one way of doing it. And then, right, so just to kind of say like the press matters, but so does the editor, because sometimes people get a little bit caught up on like, oh, I want to be published by this press, but I do, the editor-author relationship is super important. And the editor is the advocate for your book. They're the ones that are going to be telling everybody else at the press why we're publishing that book, why it matters, who it's for. They're going to be getting people excited about it. They are going to be at conferences telling people about it. They're going to be, they are like your ally. They're going to be giving you advice about the review process. And so the editor you work with, the editor relationship is just, can be really important. So sometimes people might go with a press that doesn't seem as obvious because the editor relationship is really good. And again, not one way of doing it. I just want to mention that because sometimes people just get so fixated, on particular presses and won't realize actually there's other benefits, to working with people. Okay, so I've hit my 30 minutes, but I'm just kind of zip through a few things. Making contact, I think I kind of already mentioned this, so we can come back to it. There's various ways of making contact with editors. I'm just gonna highlight even if an editor turns it down, that does not mean that's the end of, the next project could be the right fit. I did have an author I've worked with on 3 books now, and I turned down the first book that they proposed to me, and they came up to me at the conference and they said, that was the nicest rejection letter I've ever received. And I was like, oh, thanks, yes. And they were like, would you want to hear from me again? I'm like, yes, please. That was an interesting project. It wasn't right for me, but something else might be. And it was. So, and then we have, had a great relationship. So, it can be hurtful, I think, to get a rejection, but it's not always, it's not always personal. I mean, it's usually not personal, I should say. But it could be, there's so many factors. Sometimes it's I acquire 30 to 40 books a year. And I have to balance, I work on a lot of different lists. So I'm having to balance that. So sometimes it's just I can't take on any more projects in that area right now, or I can't take on any more projects right now, or, I've done too much of this already. So sometimes the reason why has nothing to do with the quality of the project. It just has to do with my own workload or my own, So, this is just to say, just know that it's not always oh, your project wasn't good or wasn't good enough for that press or something like that. It's just this wasn't the right fit, it wasn't the right moment, it wasn't whatever. So maintaining a relationship, you don't have to, but you don't have to feel oh, now I can never approach that editor again, or, And then, okay, I'm gonna skip over this, but we can talk about it later. And then I'm going to just talk about this a little bit. This is kind of nice. I know this is old, but it's still, culturally old, but still really resonant to me. Okay, peer review. People are really scared of peer review because, it is a scary hurdle when you're trying to publish your book, and it feels like people are trying to keep you out. But the best version of peer review is really, really trying to help you to write the best book possible. And I actually should have started this whole talk that way, which is, as an editor, my job and my commitment is to helping authors write the best version of the book that they can write. And so the peer review process is one of the tools for that. It really is let's find out what people think. Let's find people who, sometimes when you're sending your manuscript out for peer review, it's the first time anybody's read it like it's a book. They've been reading parts, they've been giving you feedback, but maybe they haven't actually just approached it. It's what would it be like to read this as a book? So you're getting all kinds of helpful feedback from people who typically want to help you. I'm not saying that there aren't mean reviewers out there. Certainly there can be, but that's not, for book manuscript review, it's a lot of work, and these people in the front row are yeah, it's a lot of work. And so most people are taking on a manuscript review because they want the book to be successful and they want to like it. You know what I mean? So they're not taking it on to be mean or to try to shoot somebody down. They really are usually trying to help. Some people offer more helpful advice than others, but then your editor is there as the person to guide you through that process and to help you figure out how to use the advice that you're getting to write your book. And that's really that's what an editor can help you figure out. because sometimes when you get peer reviews, you're like, oh my God, they want me to do this, they want me to do this, and that's not what I'm doing, and that's not my project. And that's cool, you know what I mean? You can say, so then how do you harness that and say, oh, that's not my project. Oh, what is my project? Oh, my project is this. Okay, how do I let this reader know that this, you know, in a non-defensive way, this is what I'm doing, this is my project and why it matters, so that maybe they still disagree with you, but they get it. They get what you're doing. So I didn't want to skip this because it's so crucial to scholarly book publishing. And then the last thing, I just making a pitch for taking care of yourself as a writer, thinking about like your writing environment. You're already like obviously in an amazing community with community support, with writing retreats. That sounds fabulous. So that's really great. You already got resources, but thinking about like how do you kind of gather those resources even when they're not, you know, even if you don't have a lot of monetary kind of resources, what else is kind of sustaining your writing practice? And then the assembling the team came up because I did have an editor one time, an author one time who said to me like, oh, you're part of my book completion team. And I was just like, okay. Like, I was like my dance instructor, and then I got my therapist, and I got this mentor, and I'm like, you're all my team, like my squad. And I was like, oh, I love that. I love being on the like book completion squad. I mean, that's my job, obviously, but like, I like thinking about it that way. It's like, oh, who's your team? You know what I mean? Who's the team? And that team could be like, I don't know, it could be your cat, both of your cats, all three of your cats. Could be on your team. You know, but just really like thinking about that is like, oh, like there's a, you know, you have these resources, you have people, creatures, infrastructures that are supporting you in this process is important. And then this listening feedback, which is, it's just hard, right? It's hard. It's hard to put your work out there. It's hard to hear what people have to say about it. But the more you do it, I think the easier it gets. And the more, and if you have the people around you who are going to do it in a helpful way, then all better, right? Okay, I think that's it. Whew, resources. I'll leave that up there for now, just so people can look at it. Okay, sorry I went a little over.
So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll come over with the mic.
Thank you for speaking with us and sharing these resources today. Transitioning from writing a lot of articles to hopefully starting a book soon, I wanted to ask you what were some of your highlights of your experience here in this residency at UCLA?
Ooh, it's just starting.
Okay.
So this is my highlight. Talking to you all. And like honestly, I do really enjoy this. I do enjoy helping people sort of embark on that, what's kind of a scary journey of like thinking about the book, especially the first book, which usually spans so many years of research. You know what I mean? From even if it's not the dissertation that's becoming the book, usually what you've done in graduate school is forming the basis of the first book. So it's often like a decade or whatever.
Hello.
Hi.
Well, thank you for the talk. And maybe my question is too soon to ask this, but following your presentation, I'm wondering, like, if I'm doing my dissertation is a big part on film studies. Mm-hmm. So images are so important, or like when you imagine your book, it looks great when you have those images of the films, right? How possible is that, or like in terms of, it could be more attractive with these visuals, but I know it could be too expensive to think of something like that. So in those cases, like film, maybe photography or other arts, how possible it is, or is there an advice to make those stills more necessary?
Yeah, this is a good question. It comes up a lot. This is going to vary from press to press and project to project. But if you work in film studies and you're publishing with a press that publishes in film studies, they're going to already have, this is already going to be on their radar, right? So we publish a lot of image-rich books because of the fields that we work in, a lot of visual culture, a lot of film and media studies. So we're used to people having film stills, and we can very easily guide people on like what, how to think about it, how to think about fair use with your images. We push people to think fair use in their use of visual materials whenever it's appropriate. But other presses have different kinds of ways of thinking about it. So it really is a press by press thing. But I think, like I mentioned, putting that, you should be upfront about that in the details of the project. I've got 40 film grabs that I'm hoping to include in this, and I feel like they're very essential. Or I've got 40, but I could get that down to 25 or 30, you know what I mean? Because your editor will have a conversation with you about that. So just being thoughtful and realistic about it. For other types of visual, you were talking particularly about film stills, and honestly, those are usually relatively easy for us because usually they don't require permission. They tend to be fairly small. We can sometimes include more of them because they're small. But if you work in art, then it's a whole other kettle of fish. You know what I mean? I'm thinking about color printing, for example, color inserts, things like that. Yeah. So that you really do have to have a conversation right off the bat with an editor about whether or not something is possible and how you would make it possible. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm Hujin Mai, I'm assistant professor here. I have been struggling with my book for some time now because this is an interdisciplinary book, and I feel like I have gone through all the problems that you have listed on your slides. And so I guess my question is more about finding the voice of me as an author. I guess one way to frame this question is because of its interdisciplinary nature, I feel like at various stages of my wrestling with the book kind of wants to be different things. At one point it wants to say this, and then 3 months later it wants to say that. And I felt like, okay, if you want to say that, I need to sort of do another chapter. And even like I have to change my tone as the author from perhaps a more authoritative and like confident tone speaking to other scholars to a more like, I'm your guide in this journey of discovery, speaking to a wider audience. And I felt like all of these options are attractive to me as an author to some extent. So I felt like my hardest struggle is to actually kind of decide, okay, this is the route I want to go. So I don't know, like, if you could share.
Yeah, I feel this question. I feel it, really. I really do, because I've seen so many people kind of struggle with this, especially with the first book, because the finding your voice part is the hardest with the first book, right? Like, and I'd say most people come into their second book being like, okay, like I have a little more, it's just confidence in a certain way, right? Because so much of the first book, particularly if it's built on the dissertation, is like you're trying to establish yourself as having certain knowledge and capacity, you know what I mean? And so sometimes people get a little caught up in that, with citations and like kind of this like, I think it was like citational armor of like, you cannot come at me because I know about all of this literature. And so sometimes like people's voices are hampered by that, and they're not really fully inhabiting their argument and what they want to say. And so it's really hard with the first book to find that footing, but it's definitely worth working on it, right? It's figuring out like, okay, I'm not sure I have advice for like how to land on the right thing, you know what I mean? Because some of that's like you have kind of figure that out. Although you could figure that out in conversation with an editor too. But that, yeah, it sounds a little bit that like, oh, I could write it this way, I could write it this way, I could write it this way, is the kind of not fully committing to the project that you want to do, you know? So how do you kind of be like, okay, this is what I want the book to do, who it's for, what I'm trying to accomplish. Now how do I, you know what I mean, inhabit that voice? I'm not sure if I answered other than to be really sympathetic to the problem of the first book. Yeah, I think, you know, but I do think, I mean, writing it out, that's one way of doing it. You know, maybe you're not maybe exactly in the place for this exercise, but an exercise I often give people is like writing like a 5 to 10 page version of their introduction where they don't cite anything. You've done that? You've done that? Okay. You probably need to choose one and get feedback from, you know what I mean, from an editor and see if it's the right, you know what I mean, if it's like, if the editor comes back and says, well, actually, maybe this would be a thing, and you're like, actually, I was thinking about doing that, you know what I mean, you might get the feedback you need. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. This has been really, really generative and really, really helpful. Kind of picking up on some of the threads that we've been talking about, I have both a conceptual question and a very short practical question.
Okay.
The short practical question is about pre-published material and kind of navigating what you've published to get into the position that you're ready to write the book versus what ends up in the book. The more kind of broad conceptual question is, I think really relevant, is how do you pitch something that to an outside audience looks very niche as a topic, I'm a medievalist, to a broader audience that you know speaks to lots of different kinds of disciplinary questions, but is coming out of a kind of niche series of source material.
Yeah, okay, I'll briefly talk about the pre-published material. You know, there's an expectation that people will have published some things already, you know, I mean, just for getting a job or whatever, you know, we expect that. And also it starts to set up your audience, right? So thinking about it that way, I'll often tell people like, you know, think about where you're placing those pieces and how they're helping to establish the readership you're hoping for the book. So, you know, if you do interdisciplinary work, you might be thinking about, oh, it should be over in this kind of journal and then this kind of place so that I'm tapping into the different audiences. And then there's also an expectation that those pieces will look very different once they're in the book and they're rewritten and reframed and responded to by peer reviewers in the context of the book. So obviously, by the time all that happens, often it look quite different. It might be almost new at that point. But it's something to mention in the book proposal. I didn't say that, I think, but you know, you could just say like, 2 pieces of this have been published in these you know, in these venues, and they're being reworked to be a part of the book. The more conceptual question about the niche area, I mean, I do all kinds of books that are on subjects that you wouldn't think people were interested in, but the trick is that you know what I mean, that you were able to demonstrate why somebody would want to think with a field or an area or a text or whatever it is, a site that they aren't already familiar with, but you've made it relevant to them. And those are the best books, right? But it does require that you frame the material and you use the material in a way that's accessible to that readership. So if you do, you said you do medievalist. Yeah, medievalist. If you're doing these like lengthy readings of text that are only going to be interesting to medievalists, then you're never going to, you know what I mean, you're not going to draw those other readers in because they're going to be like, well, this is where you've lost me because I don't know this text already, I don't know this criticism, you know what I mean? So you have to kind of be able to interest and frame the material in a way that's accessible both to the expert, you know what I mean, who's going to be, what they're going to be learning is how to think about this material in a broader framework, and then the person coming from the other area that doesn't know the material already, but maybe has, you know what I mean, a different take on it. Does that answer the
No, that's super
question?
helpful. Thank you so much.
It's not easy,
No.
but I do think, honestly, I do think some of the best books are the ones that take the unexpected material, you know what I mean, and make it interesting and relevant to readers who just had no idea, like, I didn't know I was going to be interested in this. Who knew, you know what I mean? Like, who knew the ukulele was so interesting, or whatever it is? Like, I don't, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this inspiring talk. I have a question because I'm in the middle of writing the dissertation, and the feedback I often get, because I take a lot of freedom in writing, and the feedback I get is, you're writing a book, you should write a dissertation. And I don't really understand what the difference is, so maybe you could talk about the difference of writing a dissertation and writing a book.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, usually I'm trying to convince people that the dissertation they wrote is not already a book. Because a lot of people do come to me and say, like, oh, I wrote this as a book. And I'll be like, great, but I bet it still needs, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's probably still going to need to be rethought and reworked. So usually what I'm trying to tell people is, like, slow roll. Like, we're going to, like, you know, like, let's rethink this. How to handle a dissertation committee that doesn't want you to do that, I don't know. I mean, you know, I think because dissertations, the way we often think about it is dissertations are written for such a small audience, right? You're writing to the people on your committee and to their interests, and you're also writing to demonstrate capacity and facility with literatures and with, you know what I mean, to show that, like, you know, you've done this research, right, that can back up your argument. So typically when we're working with somebody to move from dissertation to book, we're getting them to slough off all of that work that was done for the dissertation and to fully inhabit the book project, you know what I mean? And I typically think about it as, like, you're sort of, and moving from dissertation to book, often what you're doing is sort of narrowing the focus in order to broaden it. So, you know what I mean, you're really honing in on, like, oh, this is what this book is about. It's about this particular phenomenon or whatever. And by doing that narrowing, you're actually then able to do the work that you're hoping to do, you know what I mean? So, like, to actually show the broader relevance of it. So yeah, I don't know. How do you convince your dissertation? I don't know. I mean, I guess I would ask them, like, what, I mean, have you asked them what they think the components of the dissertation should be?
They couldn't really give an answer, so maybe it's more just what you said, that people cite more or have
Cite more.
Maybe that's what
They want to see, yeah, right. I think I'd ask, like, what is it that's not here that you're wanting to see, you know what I mean? And maybe knowing that's just for the dissertation, you'll be able to, you know, it'd be easier to excise it for a book. I don't know. I feel like this is a question for them.
I think you should just look at dissertations in your field and as passed with that committee.
Exactly. I like that. It's practical.
That's a model. It's like a long form. You retroactively fit the form.
Yeah.
How do you do it? Like a form you fill in. You see somebody having filled in the form, then you decide what the questions are that they filled in, you know, based on that text.
Yeah.
That has to be the committee, not a dissertation, but at least 2 or 3 members. The most powerful members of the committee.
I think what Nina is saying is, I mean, pretty much dovetails with what I'm saying, which is that, you know, dissertations are for this small audience, right? So you are tailoring it to that audience. And books are for an audience of people you don't know, hopefully. So you're writing differently, right? You know, for people you don't know. You're writing to be understood broadly, you know, by people. And when you write a dissertation, you often are writing to this very, like, you know, small group of people who presumably are going to read the whole thing, you know, because they've committed to doing so, as opposed to, you know, people reading a book who are not committed to reading the whole thing, and you actually have to, like, convince them they want to read the whole thing. I'm not saying everybody in every dissertation committee reads the whole thing. So, you know, so thinking about maybe it's just pragmatic of like, okay, how do I write this to suit these people? Then how do I do what I want to do afterwards? I think that's what most people do.
We have 2 more minutes for one last question.
Okay.
Well, I hope it's a decent one then. So I just want to get your thoughts on, say, open access digital publications against a dead tree publication, a book, especially for humanities where, you know, books are still, the single authored monograph is still the thing everyone wants, even though, say, a digital project or an open access project might have a wider reader base or be more interesting. So how do you handle that kind of tension, and where do you see that kind of?
Yeah, I don't think of those as mutually exclusive, to be completely honest. I mean, one, we do publish books in print that also can be published OA. So something can be in the book form. Now I'm just talking about just book form, right? That could be published and circulated in very conventional ways and then also available OA. So those aren't mutually exclusive categories for us. Digital projects, I mean, that's different, obviously. And we do have people who do digital projects that relate to their written projects. And then I just think of them as like, well, there are 4 different audiences engaging with the material in different ways. So if it's just the book reformulated into a digital project, well, it's gonna look, I mean, that wouldn't make any sense to just have the book. You know what I mean? Like, it would be something different. It would be a different form. 4 different people engaging with it in different ways. So you could actually have both, and we do have people who have done both, and they're interactive or side by side or whatever. I would say the hardest part of that when I've worked with people who have done digital projects that are related to their books is timing. It's pretty hard to do both of those things simultaneously because they both require a lot of time and energy and resources. And so like timing a book with a digital project can be, I've only had one author who was able to do that successfully, like actually have them come out to, you know what I mean, together. So sometimes it's prioritizing and figuring out like, okay, I need to do this first, then I'm gonna go work on this, and they're not gonna be simultaneous. So I think it's about differentiating them. And then of course, just thinking about what works for your career and for your audience. Like you might choose a digital project because you do public humanities and that's how more people are gonna, you know what I mean, encounter your work, and that's valuable to the people who are assessing you as well. Hopefully that answers it. Yeah.
I'm going to squeeze in a very quick last question because I know it's one I had when I was about to start this process with my first book. If I write, let's say I meet you here, and maybe I follow up, maybe I don't have a meeting with you, an individual meeting, but we meet. Then I send you an email with a book pitch or something, and you don't answer me after a week. I'm like, okay, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I don't know how you are with email in that regard actually. So it's like a fantasy scenario. But I know that the exchange causes a lot of anxiety. So what can I do? When should I write you again? When should I not? Like, what is the etiquette? Even the first time authors who don't know me really well, you know?
This is such a good question because I do know people stress about this all the time. So sometimes people do just write the query notes of like, hey, I'm working on this project. Would you be interested? And you know, like editors do get a lot of emails, right? So some people are better about email than others. So some people will be like, well, I'm not answering that because I don't know, they don't have time, or they just figure somebody will go to the website and submit the proposal. So I wouldn't take a non-response as like, I don't want to consider this, you know what I mean? Like it's not absolute, like I wouldn't be like now, oh, this person, well, I wouldn't take it too personally, you know what I mean, if you don't get a response, because I'd just be like, oh, that editor gets a lot of email, they don't really respond to these queries, you know, maybe I should just submit the proposal the way it says on the website, and that might get a response. But typically, if I get those, like I either respond with a like, that sounds interesting, send me the proposal, from on our website, the way I get proposals. Or I might say, that's interesting, send me the materials right now, I want to see them. Or sometimes I do just say, you know what, that's not for me, just because I don't want people to waste their time. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, you know what I mean? But like, if it seems like it's at all in my orbit of acquisitions, then then I'll tend to just be like, send me the proposal so I can see. So etiquette, I do think following up, I'd say 2 weeks, maybe, later. And saying like, I sent you this query, just wanted to see if this was of interest, you know. That seems reasonable. Like this is like a busy travel season for me, so you know, a couple weeks might go by where it's like, oh, I just did not have time at all. And so if somebody kind of nudges me, I'll be like, oh yeah, oh sorry, sorry I didn't get back to you. Yes, I'd love to see that. Or oh, sorry I didn't get back to you. I'm not interested. I don't think I'd go past 2 for like if you're blind writing. You know what I mean? You're writing to somebody you don't know. I think after the second, if you haven't heard from them, they probably aren't. I think I would assume they're not interested. Does that answer the question? I feel like there's more to it.
Does it answer the question?
Do you prefer to have a formal proposal over a query?
And so like I was saying, like I think like if it's in the realm of possibility, I usually am just telling people, okay, send the proposal. So it's not always like, it doesn't always add anything to have the query, but it's not necessarily a bad thing either. You know what I mean? Like it's not that I'm like, oh, they wrote me this query. I mean, I'll just say like, this sounds interesting, send me the proposal. Sometimes I'll be like, that sounds amazing. Like, oh, let's set up a time to talk, like immediately. I mean, you know what I mean? So sometimes you catch somebody and it's like, you've got the right person on the line and they are excited about your project and they then want to meet, and then you'll know. Like if somebody writes to you and they immediately are like, I want to meet with you, send me this stuff immediately, I'm so excited. That's good feedback, right? You're like, oh, this person is into my project, and they're going to be responsive. So it's not, but I wouldn't say if somebody takes a week to get back to you, that means they're not really interested either, because they could have been at a conference the whole time and, or some other deadline.